The gates of the prison opened slowly, groaning on their rusted hinges, and a single man stepped into the pale morning light. Raymond Cole had been locked away for 6 years, convicted of brutal domestic violence that left his wife battered and scarred, both physically and emotionally. Many believed the sentence was far too short for the crime he committed, but the system had spoken, and now he was free. He carried with him a plastic bag containing a few clothes, a stack of prison paperwork, and the bitterness that had festered inside him every day of his sentence. His hair had thinned, his eyes had sunk deeper into his face, but the fire of rage remained untouched. The world outside had changed during his years behind bars, but Raymond did not notice. Cars seemed newer, storefronts brighter, but in his mind nothing had shifted. He had spent countless nights in his cell replaying the moment his wife testified against him, her voice trembling as she described the abuse, the broken bones, the fear. He never saw himself as guilty. He saw betrayal. That was the word that haunted him. Betrayal by his wife, betrayal by his own children, and betrayal by a society that, in his twisted reasoning, wanted him caged like an animal. As he walked away from the prison, no family greeted him, no friends waited to take him home. He had burned every bridge before his sentence even began. His wife, Laura, had not written once. She had moved back into her childhood home with their 2 children, determined to rebuild the life he had torn apart. In Raymond's mind, this was her final act of treachery, a declaration that she had chosen to live without him. The small town knew about his release almost as soon as it happened. Whispers spread through grocery store aisles and diners, people lowering their voices as they warned one another. Everyone remembered the trial. Everyone remembered the photographs of Laura's injuries. Some recalled the way their children had described hearing shouting and glass breaking late at night. He had been a monster behind closed doors, and now he was free again. The fear returned to the community like smoke after a fire, invisible but suffocating. Raymond walked the streets with nowhere to go. He found a cheap motel that smelled of mold and cigarette smoke, and paid for a single night with the few dollars the prison gave him upon release. He lay on the stiff mattress staring at the ceiling, his mind consumed with thoughts of his family. He imagined Laura tucking the children into bed, reading them stories, and laughing in the house where he no longer belonged. That picture twisted into rage. In his mind, they were living happily because they had destroyed him, and he could not forgive them for it. Each day that followed, he wandered aimlessly. He visited the corner where he and Laura once argued in public, the diner where she had worked part-time, the streets his children used to ride their bikes on. Everywhere he went, memories clawed at him, not with sorrow but with a gnawing resentment that hardened into obsession. He was convinced that his wife had turned the children against him, poisoning them with stories about his cruelty. He believed they no longer saw him as a father, but as a monster, and in his mind that was unforgivable. The release that should have been a chance to rebuild was instead the spark of something darker. Raymond carried no hope of starting over. He carried only anger. The people who had once been his world had become his enemies, and he saw no future except one that would bring him back to their doorstep. As the nights grew colder, and the days shorter, he began to linger longer near the places they lived, watching from a distance, invisible but always present. In his mind, he had not lost his family, they had been stolen from him. And in the silence of his motel room, he promised himself he would take them back, no matter the cost. Raymond Cole did not waste much time after his release before returning to the streets he once called home. He knew exactly where his wife and children lived, the old house that belonged to Laura's parents, tucked on the edge of town with a yard bordered by thin woods. He began showing up there in silence, standing far enough away to avoid notice but close enough to watch every detail of their lives unfold. At first, his visits were short. He would stand under the cover of darkness for half an hour, his breath visible in the cold night air, then slip back to the cheap room he had rented above a noisy bar. But with each passing day, the pull grew stronger. His visits stretched into hours, his eyes fixed on the light in the upstairs window, convinced it was the children's bedroom, convinced that they were laughing without him, forgetting him. Neighbors noticed the change before Laura did. One woman spotted a figure near the trees on a foggy morning, but assumed it was a hunter passing through. Another man swore he had seen someone standing near the driveway late at night, but dismissed it as his imagination. The figure always vanished before anyone could get close enough to confront him. Yet the unease in the neighborhood grew steadily, a whisper of danger hanging over the quiet street. Inside the house, Laura began to feel a sense of dread she couldn't explain. Doors she knew she had locked were sometimes unlocked when she checked them in the morning. A garden tool she had left by the shed was suddenly resting against the back door. The dog, normally quiet, began barking at shadows in the yard long after midnight. Laura wanted to believe these were small accidents, tricks of her own anxiety, but deep down she felt the truth pressing in on her. She had always feared this day would come. Raymond, for his part, grew less cautious. The obsession that had driven him for years inside prison now consumed him outside of it. He walked past the house during daylight, not caring if someone might recognize him. He followed Laura once as she drove to the grocery store, staying several cars behind until she parked. He stood in the same aisle as her, close enough to smell the perfume she wore, but never close enough for her to see him. The thrill of being near her, without her knowing, fed his hunger, convincing him that he was still connected to the family who wanted nothing to do with him. Police were eventually called after a neighbor reported seeing a man loitering near the woods again, but when officers arrived, Raymond was gone. They searched briefly, found nothing, and left. With no evidence of trespassing or threats, there was nothing more they could do. When Laura later reported her suspicions that her ex-husband was following her, she was told to keep her doors locked and call if she saw him directly. The words were meant to reassure her, but they felt like a dismissal. She knew how quickly Raymond could slip into violence, and she knew that if he wanted to hurt her, no lock would stop him. Raymond began to spend nights in the woods behind the house, crouched in the dark, staring at the faint glow of lights inside. He grew familiar with the rhythms of the household, when the children went to bed, when Laura turned off the television, when the house finally went dark. Every sound that drifted out, the laughter of the children, the clink of dishes in the sink, felt like a taunt to him. In his warped mind, their happiness was built on his suffering, and every passing night fueled the idea that he needed to correct it. The longer he lingered, the bolder he became. He moved objects in the yard deliberately, just to see if Laura would notice. He left faint footprints near the back porch to remind her he was there. The game was his way of reclaiming power, making her feel the fear he had carried in prison. To him, fear was control, and control was the first step toward taking back what he believed belonged to him. Laura confided to her sister that she no longer felt safe, that she thought Raymond was close, though she had no proof. She began considering moving again, even though it would uproot the children from the life they had just begun to rebuild. She had hoped that distance would protect them, but distance was never enough for a man like Raymond. His obsession had narrowed into a single point, and no matter where she went, he would follow. What she didn't know was that the game he had been playing was already nearing its end, and his thoughts were no longer about waiting or watching. They were about acting. The rain fell steadily that evening, soaking the streets and painting everything in a dull sheen. Raymond sat in his room above the bar, staring at the wet window with an intensity that bordered on madness. For weeks, he had been circling his family like a predator, content to frighten them from the shadows, but the weight of his obsession had grown too heavy to carry. Watching was no longer enough. The thought of his children sleeping soundly in a home where his name was cursed, the image of Laura smiling without him, burned in his mind like acid. He convinced himself he had been erased from their lives, and in his fractured reasoning, the only way to reclaim control was to make sure none of them could live without remembering him. He began to prepare in ways that were both careful and deranged. At a local hardware store, he purchased a roll of duct tape, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, and a large hunting knife, each bought on separate days to avoid suspicion. At a pawn shop, he found an old crowbar and added it to his collection. He carried these items back to his room one by one, laying them out on the bed as if building a puzzle only he understood. He studied them for hours, imagining how each piece would fit into the plan forming in his mind. His warped sense of justice told him these objects were not weapons but tools to restore the balance of his broken life. While he prepared, Laura moved closer to the edge of panic. The feeling of being watched never left her. She caught glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows that lingered too long near her windows. Her children had begun to sense her fear, asking why she checked the locks 3 and 4 times a night, why she jumped at every noise. She knew she couldn't stay much longer. She contacted a realtor and asked about houses farther away, but moving was not something she could do overnight. She needed time, and time was exactly what she no longer had. Raymond followed her more openly now. He waited outside her workplace, sitting in his car until she left, then trailing her vehicle at a distance. He timed his steps so that when she walked out of a store, she would feel that electric chill of being observed without ever spotting him. To him, these moments were intoxicating. Every flicker of unease on her face, every nervous glance over her shoulder, made him feel powerful again. He believed she had stripped him of control once, but now he was stripping it from her piece by piece. In his twisted thoughts, the children became part of the problem. He believed Laura had turned them against him, that they no longer remembered him as their father, but as the monster he tried to deny he was. He pictured them whispering with their mother about how they hated him, how they wished he would disappear forever. The bitterness curdled into hatred, and soon he began to view them not as children but as obstacles. If they loved her and not him, then they were guilty in his mind. One night, he sat at a diner drinking cheap coffee, staring blankly at the rain-soaked street outside. He scribbled notes on a napkin, not words but fragments of a plan. Times when the lights went out at Laura's house. The best way to enter through the back door. How long it might take police to respond in their quiet neighborhood. He crumpled the napkin and shoved it in his pocket, his heart pounding with a sense of destiny. To him, the act he was planning wasn't murder but justice, a final chapter that would ensure no one could laugh at his downfall again. Meanwhile, Laura grew desperate. She told her sister she wanted to leave town as soon as possible, that she feared Raymond was building up to something terrible. Her sister urged her to call the police again, but Laura had already tried. Without evidence, they had shrugged it off as paranoia. She felt trapped in her own home, waiting for a storm she knew was coming but couldn't stop. Raymond's breaking point arrived without warning. In the dark corners of his mind, the decision had already been made. Watching had lost its thrill. Planning no longer calmed his rage. Only action remained. As he gathered his tools and zipped his coat against the rain, he felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, his mind was clear. He knew what he was going to do, and nothing in the world would stop him. The night came without warning, quiet and ordinary to everyone but Raymond. A thin crescent moon hung in the sky, the streets silent as most families settled into sleep. Laura had tucked her children into bed after a long weekend, their laughter still lingering faintly in the house. She checked the locks, as she always did, her movements slower than usual, heavy with exhaustion and fear. The house seemed peaceful, but outside, in the cold darkness of the woods, Raymond was already waiting. He had been there for hours, crouched in the shadows, his clothes damp from the evening dew, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the living room window. In his bag were the tools he had collected over weeks: duct tape, rope, a crowbar, and the hunting knife. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, every step etched into memory like a script. He told himself it was not an act of cruelty but of destiny. He believed he was taking back what had been stolen, that by erasing those who had betrayed him, he could finally silence the voices that tormented him. With steady hands, he pulled the crowbar free and approached the back door. The glass shattered with a muffled crack, loud enough to wake the children upstairs. The sound carried across the yard, startling a neighbor's dog into barking, but Raymond did not hesitate. He stepped inside, his shoes crunching on the shards as he entered the kitchen. The air smelled of leftover dinner, warm and faintly comforting, but to him it was an insult, proof that life had gone on without him. Laura came rushing from the hallway, panic in her eyes. For a split second, she froze, staring at the figure she had feared for months. He blocked the only exit, his silhouette filling the space, his breathing heavy and ragged. The children's footsteps thudded against the floorboards upstairs as they stirred awake, frightened by the noise. Raymond's rage boiled over at the sound of them, the reminder that they were not running into his arms, but into their mothers. The chaos erupted in seconds. Laura tried to reach for the phone on the counter, but Raymond swung the crowbar, knocking it away. She screamed, a piercing cry that carried through the night, and somewhere a neighbor stirred and reached for their own phone. But inside the house, the screams only fueled his frenzy. He lunged forward, dragging her by the arm as she fought to pull free. The children appeared at the top of the stairs, frozen in terror as they watched the nightmare unfold below. Raymond turned his gaze on them, his expression twisted with hatred. To him, they were not innocent, they were part of the betrayal, poisoned by the lies of their mother. He stormed up the stairs, his heavy steps echoing, and the children scattered into their rooms, slamming doors, hiding in corners. The house that had once been their sanctuary became a trap, each room closing in around them. The violence that followed was swift and merciless. Neighbors later recalled hearing multiple crashes, more screams, and then a sudden silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. By the time the first police car arrived, alerted by frantic 911 calls, the house was still. Officers entered cautiously, weapons drawn, but what they found inside was worse than any of them had imagined. Raymond sat in the living room, his clothes soaked in blood, the hunting knife resting loosely in his hand. Around him was devastation, a scene of horror that no words could fully capture. He did not attempt to run, did not speak when officers ordered him to the ground. He simply raised his hands, his face calm, almost serene, as if the storm within him had finally passed. The officers restrained him quickly, dragging him out into the cold night air. The flashing lights painted the street red and blue. Neighbors gathering in hushed, horrified clusters. Whispers spread instantly, disbelief mingling with grief, as the realization of what had happened sank in. The family who had worked so hard to escape him had been destroyed in a single night, and the man responsible showed no trace of regret. The silence of the house lingered long after the sirens faded, a chilling reminder of the terror that had erupted behind its walls. For the town, it was a moment that would never be forgotten. For Raymond, it was the moment he had been waiting for, the act he believed had sealed his twisted version of justice. The news spread quickly, first through the quiet neighborhood, where flashing lights lit up the night, then through the entire town by morning. The horror inside Laura's home became the subject of whispers at grocery stores, offices, and classrooms. A family that had once seemed to escape the grip of violence had been destroyed in one night, and the man responsible was the very person they feared most. Reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras flashing as Raymond was led into a police vehicle, his face pale and blank, as if he were already somewhere far away. The images captured of him that night became the defining symbol of the tragedy, replayed endlessly on television screens and online. At the police station, Raymond sat in silence during questioning. Officers asked him why he did it, what had led to such brutality, but he offered nothing. He stared at the table, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him, expressionless. Some believed he felt no remorse, others thought he was lost in his own madness, detached from reality. What was clear was that he had carried out the act with precision. waiting for the perfect moment, and striking without hesitation. The crime was not random or impulsive. It was the result of weeks of obsession and years of resentment. The trial began months later, attracting national attention. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, with reporters lining the back walls and victims, family members clutching tissues in the front row. The prosecution laid out the case in chilling detail, presenting photographs, forensic evidence, and the testimonies of neighbors who had heard the screams. They described Raymond's history of violence, his conviction for domestic abuse, and the warnings Laura had made before her death. To the prosecution, this was not simply murder. It was the predictable outcome of a man the system had released despite the danger he posed. The defense struggled to humanize him, pointing to his difficult upbringing, years of neglect, and untreated anger issues. They attempted to argue mental instability, suggesting he had been incapable of fully understanding his actions. But the jury remained unmoved. The evidence was overwhelming, and Raymond's lack of emotion during the trial only deepened the sense of horror. He sat motionless, showing no reaction as gruesome details were recounted, no flicker of grief when pictures of his wife and children were shown. It was as if he had already accepted the outcome, whatever it would be. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath, guilty on all counts. The words rang through the room, heavy and final. Laura's family wept quietly, some burying their faces in their hands, others staring at Raymond, as though hoping for even a hint of acknowledgement that he understood the weight of what he had done. But he remained still, his gaze fixed on the floor. The judge handed down the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, it was justice, but justice felt shallow against the loss of an entire family. The town carried the weight of the tragedy long after the trial ended. The house where it happened sat empty for months, its windows boarded, its yard overgrown. Some avoided walking past it altogether, unable to shake the memory of what had occurred inside. Children whispered about it on their way to school, calling it haunted, while adults spoke of it in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might stir the ghosts of that night. In the years that followed, the case was referenced in debates about prison reform and the dangers of releasing violent offenders without proper supervision. Laura's surviving relatives became advocates for stronger protections, pushing for laws that would make it harder for abusers with violent histories to return to their victims. Their fight was driven not only by grief, but by the hope that no other family would suffer the same fate. Raymond spent his days behind bars in the same silence he had carried during the trial. He refused interviews, refused to explain himself, and seemed content to fade into the background of prison life. In the public eye, he became a symbol of something larger than himself, the embodiment of a system's failure, and the chilling reminder that some threats never fade, even after years behind concrete walls. His name was spoken less as time passed, but the memory of his crimes never left the town that had once feared his shadow. For those who had known Laura and her children, the grief never fully healed. They remembered birthdays that would never be celebrated, school plays that would never be attended, milestones erased by one man's obsession. Their absence lingered in the community like an open wound, a reminder that the line between freedom and danger had been crossed the moment Raymond walked out of prison. The sentence ensured he would never hurt anyone again, but it could not erase the devastation he left behind. For the rest of his life, he would sit in silence, locked away, while the world outside carried the scars of his violence.